In the New York City public service system, the government is run by two unique but equally vital groups: the elected and the appointed officials who design initiatives and the employees tasked with implementing them. These are our stories.
All right. So we're back on Civil Conversations. It's been a crazy long time, and I'm really sorry about that. But life sort of kicked in, and I had to prioritize other things in life. But I am so excited to have this conversation today because this is actually one that I've been looking forward to for a very long time. And I do want to say that it's the person who I'll be interviewing today and who will be our guest today, someone who actually partially inspired this whole idea. So over the years, for those of you that listen to Initial Conversations, this came up from just being at social events, from being at happy hours, from talking with colleagues around the water cooler, around break times and stuff like that. Getting our perspectives. There's a lot of insight that comes up in speaking to colleagues because we're the ones who do the work day to day. And again, it's sort of like the voices that are not raised. And I've had lots of interesting conversations with people who work in different capacities in city government. And our guest today is one of those people. So I want to welcome you formally. And I also want to give you kudos. So I have Alan joining me today, who works for the police department. And I'm very excited to have you here. Probably back in the fall, we had a conversation. I guess this idea got previewed, and I was sort of shy, I'm not gonna lie. I've had this idea about how do we interview, how do we get perspectives out there of like all these amazing people that I know in my life, and I'm sure the many others that are out there working in city government. So I had this idea in my head, wasn't sure exactly how to make it materialize. And my husband actually was the one who's like sort of forcing me to share it with people. And you were like really behind it. And so I wanted to say thank you for being supportive of it and for being here today. Yeah, and
Absolutely.
welcome. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Of course. And so I do want to sort of open up the conversation a bit with I guess a framing and some norms. Like we talk about this in education and in certain like facilitated conversations. And I'm going to say that for the folks who are listening. But we're going to be talking about policing today. And that's been a very sensitive topic, a very hot button topic, and for good reasons in some ways. But there's also very varying perspectives, right? And so my hope today is to have people approach this conversation and to listen in with an open mind. I personally can say I have never been a police officer. I have never shadowed. I've never done ride along. I've never known the full extent of the work that police officers do. I, as a citizen, of course, have had interactions with police officers, and we can go into what those have looked like and what others have experienced, of course. But the goal of today is to really get a sense of like what it is like to actually be a police officer, not only as like a profession, but also within New York City, right? We're a sort of unique microcosm, you could say. I don't know if you know this, but I should have sort of done my research, but I'm going to assume that we're probably one of the largest, if not the largest police department in the country.
Yeah, we are.
Yep. And so, I come to it from the school system side. Like I knew for sure that we were the largest school system, we're the largest police department. And so that's, a huge city. I looked up recent data. We're 8.8 million people. So trying to understand, what does that look like? What does your role look like? What does that mean? How do you support? How do you enforce? How do you regulate? How do you keep people safe in a city that's 8.8 million people strong? So I just want to put that out there for people to, if you have your beliefs, you have your views, to just be open-minded, because you may not have encountered what it's like to be a police officer. You might have your perceptions, you might have experiences, and those are very valid, but this just be open-minded. And I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Alan, but we'll see how this goes. It's about experience. It's about encountering what it's like in real life to do the work that we're advocating for, and trying to get people to build an awareness of working for the city and in the city. And so, again, just encouraging people to just be open-minded. So anything you want to add there?
I just want to say that I do have almost 20 years of experience. But this is just my opinion and where I'm at and what I've gone through here. This is not necessarily the opinion of the NYPD, or I'm just here obviously as a friend and just someone to give insight to what kind of policing it's like from a more impartial perspective.
Sure.
Um, But again, this is just my opinion and not the opinion of others or anything like that. Or
Yeah.
this is nothing attached to the NYPD. This is just,
Yeah.
two colleagues really just trying to figure out more of what, police officers do and just the legal system and how it applies to New York City.
Sure, absolutely. And in life, I think I'm realizing this more and more as of late with everything that's happening at a broader scale, but we're all just individuals trying to do our best to get by.
Yeah.
And we all come to life with a different perspective and different experiences. I think we've spoken about this. And so, yes, it's my life, it's my experience. It's not like Liz knows and has all the answers. I'll never pretend to say so. And I don't think that you would ever say so either, but these are just experiences that are worth sharing in case they're helpful for people to have for context and inform, right, our worldview. I actually saw a really cool quote, and I'm gonna pull it up because I thought this was like really amazing. But Adam Grant, who is a organizational psychologist, he pops up in people's LinkedIn feeds like all the time. This guy has like, I'll say like quote bangers for those who like follow this stuff. But very insightful. And I'll look for it. But it's basically about like I'll find it. Oh my gosh, I don't want to butcher it, but it's incredible. But anything is like you might not know everything. There's always an opportunity to learn something new. Today's a new day. And so we're going to try and build some knowledge and just some awareness. So we'll do the best that we can and we'll go from there. So you sort of spoke to this about having 20 years of experience. And I guess I would love to know how many years you've been doing this work. You sort of mentioned that, but I don't know I don't know if you want to share the exact number, but generally you've been doing this for about 20 years. And so when you were growing up, I don't know if you mind like sharing a bit of your history and your background.
No, no, not at all. I am an
And
open book.
then yeah, so just curious, like if I don't know if people have perceptions or ideas of like where police officers come from and the backgrounds that they come from, but if you wouldn't mind sharing like where you grew up or the circumstances under which you grew up, and like did you think you were going to be a police officer, or was this like what was
No.
your path to your career and your profession?
So I grew up in the Bronx. Went to school in the Bronx. Single parent household. Although my father was definitely in my life, it wasn't under the same roof. I don't know if that shaped anything really. My mother was very, very strict. So even the times that I kind of wanted to wander off and, explore as any teenager would, she was very stern. So that was very limited into the troubles and exposure of the streets. Um, I never wanted to be a cop, and like obviously, like as a teenager, you grow up with, you see in our even then in our culture, in our music, and on TV, and because I have very limited experience or interaction with police, I only went by what I was told, and I only went by what I was able to see and listen to on the music and the movies and
Hmm.
everything else, that sort. You almost learn from these different avenues as opposed to coming up with you know, your own opinion, especially at such a young age.
Hmm.
Um, and honestly, I did not want to be a cop at all. It was like the last thing on my mind, honestly.
Hmm.
I did go to college for a couple of years and I studied criminal justice. And I had the idea that I kind of wanted to be a lawyer, but then I realized how much work it was. And I did become a paralegal. And it was then that I realized I didn't want to be in an office. Like that was not my
Hmm.
setting. I was like, it's just the cubicle, and I immediately knew that the office setting was not for me. But I did enjoy criminal justice. I did enjoy. I don't know if it's like the aspect of like just the way everything is broken down, like the judicial and everything, how it all comes together. Um, but then I had a child very young. And that kind of made me say, all right, well, whatever I'm gonna do, I need to focus now. And I applied for the NYPD through the support of my wife now, and I did it. And I told myself, you know what, I'm gonna do this for a year or two until I kind of figure it out.
Yeah.
And at that point, I was 22 years old, and I told myself, you know what, I'll do this for a year or two. I'll figure it out, and we'll see how it goes. And I have to tell you, been 18, almost 18 years since then. It has been the best decision that I could have made.
That's
for
incredible.
myself, obviously, but for my family, for my kids' future. And that's it. When I first started, it was almost like an immediate, I don't want to say satisfaction, but I obviously you can't you come in here with the stigma of what police officers should be. But I immediately noticed that I guess what I took pride in was that I noticed that you can't make a difference in your community if you're not in a position to make a difference in your community.
Mm,
So once I started interacting with people and I started, as the time went by policing, I would have people come back to me and tell me, you know what, I know this happened and that happened, but I appreciate the way you handled it, or I appreciate the way you spoke to me that day. Or, and I realized that's almost like I kind of tag along with that. And I was like, wow, like everybody just wants to be heard or felt different, you know?
sure.
But going back to that's kind of where I grew and the household and why I chose this profession. I mean,
Yeah.
or maybe the profession chose me.
It
I don't
chose
know, but
you.
this is
Yeah.
definitely the last
Sometimes.
thing that I ever wanted to do.
Yeah.
But
No.
it's been a blessing ever since.
That's incredible. That's incredible. Yeah, I mean, people's lives, you might intend to go one way, and then, you were speaking about being a lawyer. Some lawyers go to law school, they're lawyers, and then they wind up becoming chefs and, you know, going on a whole different types of like not tangents, but their lives take them in a whole different direction. Because sometimes you only learn by doing. So it seems like getting immersed in some way and doing the paralegal experience, going to school, sort of like directed you to this. And it's fascinating how you're like, oh yeah, I'll try this out. And then here you are so many years later. Feels
Yeah.
like it went by very fast. I can't believe you were 22. I mean, how do you even make a decision at the age of 22 to do something like this? I mean, it's fascinating. And I do want to know, I guess, a bit about what it means to be a police officer. What does the job even entail? You're a young person. You may have many others. And I also want to say too, like I've sort of had this perception, and maybe it's not true, but like things like the police department, like the fire department are very generational. Like fathers of fathers of fathers were part of the PD. I don't know if it's like that anymore. You're definitely sort of like a first generation because you did not have that entry point or that experience of coming from a family or like a lineage of law enforcement. So curious, just like what what was that like for you? Do you find that that's still something? And then just understanding as a police officer, what does that actually entail? What does it mean to be a police officer? What are your duties? So if people don't understand on a day-to-day stuff that you do, what's sort of expected of you, what goes in a day, because I do have some stats and some data, and I do want to talk about it later. But I'm like, okay, a day in a life? What's a day in the life of a police officer? And you've sort of changed positions over the years, so I'm sure it's probably complicated to answer. But I'm just
Yeah,
curious for
I
those
was
that
I
don't
was just
know,
thinking that,
what goes into it? What does that mean?
yeah. Well, that has to be it has to be more of a specific question in the
Okay, so
sense
let
where
me
like
say it this time. So when you were a
let's
22-year-old, what was it like to be a police officer? And then we could
all right.
talk about that now, because I'm sure
So
it's probably very different experiences.
all right. So during those days, um, you kind of went to a precinct. You were a rookie. You got put on foot. And they taught you learn the streets, learn the back of buildings, which buildings connect. You kind of got a more raw experience of what that neighborhood was. And after time of you walking that same footpost, you knew who hung out in front of the bodegas all day. You knew who looked out the window all the time.
Mm,
You knew the same cars that double parked and why they were double parked because maybe they were picking up their kid, at the same
mm,
time every time. So you kind of got to learn a little bit of like that neighborhood. Um, but it was all a foot post. And it was also very driven in like if you see something, do something,
mm,
you know? So it helped. I don't want to say if it helped, but I think it held the city more accountable in the sense where like because there were always cops around, um, like people were just less likely to do things, especially when cops are a lot more interactive and willing to approach people and say, you guys can't do this, you guys can't do that.
mhm,
Um, it just kept people in the neighborhood more accountable to what they could and couldn't do. But that was like when I first started. And like anything else, things changed, policies change, politics change. Eventually, after you do your foot post, you end up, either going to a patrol car, which at that point you're just answering jobs and filling out paperwork,
mm,
or you get put into, at that time we have more in in precinct units, such as like street narcotics. So although there is an entire narcotics unit, they have a lot more resources. They focus on bigger things. In the precinct, you also had a narcotics unit, which kind of just followed up on smaller complaints of narcotics from the community. And you kind of just did surveillances and just spoke to people. They had a conditions team, which is almost dealing with at that time, like if there were vendors, like unlicensed vendors, things of that
Mm-hmm.
sort. So you dealt with different aspects of what was going on in that community. That was as a police officer in that precinct when it started. Of course, things have changed since then, but that's pretty much what it was. Like, and if you're answering the jobs, you're kind of going from job to job, 911, 911 call, and the good and bad with that is that some neighborhoods have a high volume of 911 calls and some don't.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're in an area where you have a high volume of 911 calls, it's a lot more, it's a lot less personal because I'm coming to you, you have a problem. If it's a civil, I have to tell you it's civil. If it's something happened to you, if it's a past crime, I take a report with as much information as I can. And so it's not, it almost it's not personal. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's like you're just taking the information you need because you need to move on to the other seven, eight, other nine 911 calls that you have.
I
So
see.
it becomes very routine. Um, where unfortunately sometimes certain jobs or certain people, like it needs to be a little bit more personal.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't quite often happen that way because you're just thinking about going to the next job, going to the next 911. And we're also held accountable for that. If we
Mm-hmm.
take too long to go to the next 911 job, you know, it's a reflection on us. Reports have to be, you know, generated by our supervisors why we took so long to go to this place and that place. So we kind of go to every 911 job where knowing I just need to be able to retrieve as much information about what happened as possible before I move on to the next one. But what does that do is it now release that person, that victim complainant, where just like, all right, they just came by, grab some name, grab some stuff, and then they left, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, like you said, there's so many people in the city. Um, certain neighborhoods are just so much busier than others. So everybody's experience will be a lot different when it comes to when they call 911.
Sure. And what about the content of those calls? I mean, I feel like if you're responding to, I don't know what people call 911 for, and I'm sure depending on the communities, it probably differs. But if you're calling for, I don't know, fist fights versus, your neighbors being noisy, I'm assuming some people still try and call 911 for that, even though we have 311 now. But if you have like
Yeah.
these complex calls or a high volume of these calls, what does that look like? Is it the same response, or I don't know, what how does that sort of come into play in terms of like having like extremes, or like I'm thinking of different communities to your point, right? Like you're responding to different things, you have different problems, but I'm just thinking of
Mhm.
certain ones, right? It might be, I don't know, like what extreme, or I guess like if you're out on a night, what kind of calls are you responding to, and do people realize like, wow, I'm responding to 10 of these things sort of like back to back? Have you
Yeah.
have you encountered that? Like what what
Oh,
what kind of things are you
absolutely.
responding to, and
Um, So let me just start also by saying I was a police officer in the Bronx, and then my three promotions have also been in the Bronx. So I pretty much been here my whole time with a small exception of going to Manhattan for a little while and then coming right back to the Bronx. Um, so all I know is the Bronx. So I can't speak about Staten Island or Queens.
sure, of course.
I've never worked there. And sure, you hear
Hmm.
stories and you kind of know what's going on, but I can only speak on this side of the island, I guess you say.
Yeah.
And even within the Bronx, it's so crazy how certain precincts are high in robberies and certain precincts could be high in burglaries, or certain precincts are high in like car break-ins,
Mm.
you know? So every area is so different. With that being said, you know, GLAs like right now it's a huge thing, and that's like the stealing of cars or, you know, people's car parts. It's a big deal. So you can have 4 or 5 at that in one time at one,
Uh,
at one night, one shift.
yeah,
And that's like a big deal. But you got to remember a lot of these, when people do these certain crimes, they try to monopolize as much as they can from this and kind of move on and not really, it's not necessarily a crime of opportunity, how some crimes are. This is more like strategic. All right, we're gonna go to this neighborhood, we're gonna do as much as we can, and we're gone. We're not gonna come back here.
sure.
So when you have a night like that, you can have 5 to 10 incidents. So now you're responding to 5 to 10, calls, whether it's within that 8 hour or whether it moves on to the next shift and the next, sector car has to come so it could become overwhelming. But different areas have
Yeah.
a volume of high crimes. I think robberies also are kind of the same, burglaries. These are crimes that when people do them, they plan it and it almost seems like I'm gonna do as much as I can, until I feel like
Hmm.
something's, going wrong.
Sure.
So that's why you get whenever they happen sporadic, and it's just
Yeah. Yep.
um,
Yep. Sounds like, yeah, intense. I didn't even think about that because I have experienced, unfortunately, having my car broken in. And then we were like, I don't know, let's say a row of 10 cars. And I didn't think about a police officer has to respond to that and do reports with like all 10 of those people in a row, let alone if they went
that,
a few blocks away and then hit up a few cars there. Honestly, it was just like, I want my report because I need to report this. I want to see sort of like what happens.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and
And it's
yeah,
it's a lot of paperwork. It's not like a simple, little checklist. Like
sure,
it's become more and more detailed oriented, so it just becomes more time consuming.
sure,
That's one of the things where reporting has gotten better. Um, but you kind of sacrifice better reporting with more time. So now these officers are spending more time writing these reports because they're so much more detailed now.
hmm. And I did want to talk about that because in terms of like talking about what the job entails, one, I am curious about like the breadth of what it is that sort of like the police are responsible for. Because I was looking at the website and it's sort of like, hey, we're covering, subways, we're covering traffic. And that certainly I can tell you being out in the city seems like people have gone like crazy. I'm going to use select choice words to say about people driving out here in the city these days. But then you have like these, I didn't even think about that. Foot police, you got folks who are responding to calls. But so like trying to understand beyond just the patrolling, which is I guess what I see as the primary function, because that's what I see. What else goes into doing your job? You mentioned paperwork, but like what else goes into a day?
All right. So when you mention the patrolling and the different, so let me maybe take a step back and let you know, like there's 3 different bureaus. There's housing, there's transit, and there's patrol. Transit police are assigned to transit. So
Hmm.
all they do is go up and down the transit system, trying to identify certain things that are happening in the transit system. Um, so that's like their main focus.
Hmm.
And I'm sure you've heard like they have undercovers, they try to look for pickpocketing. They have another unit that kind of know more or less they've been able to identify people who focus on sex offenses and have been previously arrested for these kind of things. And like there are people that go on the train and they literally wait for crowded trains just to press up on people.
Wow.
So like there's units that like look for those kind of things. So there's even within transit, there's different types of small little units focus on different things to help, so that it's not so broad. Like these groups go out to do these kind of things.
Hmm.
And then you have the same thing in housing. Housing police focus just on housing property. They just deal with NYCHA. And they try to work with NYCHA and who, the complaints are coming from and what building is the most problematic. They have housing could have a lot of like you said, loud noises, a lot of domestic calls. So they have a bigger domestic violence union, like a group,
Hmm.
basically. And so whatever condition is more or whatever condition is higher, they kind of help focus, put a unit to help focus on that. So that's like housing, that's transit, and then patrol. Like I mentioned earlier, like you have guys that, again, football's not so much these days, like it was when I started again at 22 years old. But they still have the same. It's still the same concept. It's to be able to put people out there that, just so that the public can see the police, and hopefully they feel much safer when they see the police in some neighborhoods. But it's the same thing. You have different units within that precinct, and then that's kind of split in half with the guys who actually do respond to 911. So not every police officer uh responds to 911 calls. Like you have just traffic cops, and they basically give out summonses for like the traffic infractions, but they also respond to police accidents. So that's why I guess the job is trying to do a good job of being able to break down the conditions of the precincts, and then just give a unity, like a focus on that. So like you guys are gonna only deal with traffic infractions and accident reports. You guys are gonna deal with 911 calls. You're gonna deal with domestic violence and only domestic violence. And you're gonna follow up on those victims. You're gonna see if you can get them help and reach out to them. So even within the precinct, they're broken down into, I guess you would say, like little sections, you know?
Okay. Yep. Gotcha. Super complex. And beyond all that, like you have the administrative paperwork, so you're covering all of those areas and all of those types of, I don't know how to describe it. I guess in general, it's sort of like law enforcement, but in different spaces and places right across the city. You have your paperwork aspect. What about like, so if I got a ticket and I go to fight it, believe like, I don't know, a ranger's supposed to, if I did it in Jersey, like a ranger's supposed to report, are those things that you also have to do? So like court appearances, anything like that. So if you're seeing like something from start to finish, is that something that you also, does every police officer have to be involved in that? Does it depend on like the title, the type of work that you do, or is that something that's, I guess, a mandate or an expectation depending on like the offense or whatever you reported out to sort of respond to?
Okay. So if you do, no, I'm just trying to see how I can word it,
Yeah,
because it could be a little complex. So if you are involved in an arrest, you are going to court. Um,
gotcha.
you're basically working on the arrest paperwork. It gets sent down to the courts. And you're kind of like waiting on that side of, that legal aspect to be cleared. And so yeah, that requires you going to court, not just on that day of the arrest, but you might have to also go to grand jury. Sometimes you go to trial. So whatever you do does have like a follow-up.
I see.
If you give a summons, you're gonna have to appear at traffic court at some point. If you were involved in an accident where someone was injured, sometimes you get called by civil unions, and you have to go and report on that. So you are constantly being taken out of your day to day because of to follow up on the things you may have done in the past, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's a new arrest, whether it's a summons, whether you observe something. It can even be as simple as you were the first responding officer to a homicide, and they might need you to go to the ME to identify the person that you saw on when you approach that crime scene. So
Mm-hmm.
it could even be something as simple as that. Like you're always being pulled to do different things.
Mm-hmm.
Not to mention New York City, as you know, as big as we are, we have festivities, we have parades, we have all
Yeah.
sorts of different, constantly being pulled for that as well. So it's a constant balance between doing what you're assigned to do, and then also being taken out of that to do other things as well.
Yeah. And you mentioned ME. So what does ME stand for those of us
It's
that
a
don't know?
medical examiner. I'm sorry, medical
Gotcha. No,
examiner,
you're fine. You're
and
fine.
those are the guys that
Yeah. Yeah.
come.
Yep. I gotcha. And I do want to sort of speak about your work experience. I mean, we've definitely been talking about that, but you mentioned sort of like responding to homicides and, in terms of thinking of work environments and work experiences, is like, trying to think of things that I might complain about. And I'm like, wow, I can't complain because I haven't had to see certain, it's like stupid things, perhaps like petty things. And I'm like, wow, I really shouldn't complain. But curious about like highs, lows, crazy encounters or experiences that you've had. I mean, there's certain things that I would hope to never have to see, just like walking around the city on a given day. And I'm probably sure these are things that you probably have seen or experienced more than you probably may have wanted to. So I'm curious, like in your experience, and just to bring it in for people. Again, another aspect of the job is dealing probably with really shitty circumstances and having to see really shitty things. And I apologize for cursing, but it's just true. I mean, I feel like there's no other way to categorize it. But what kind of things have you seen? I mean, what are some of the highs, I guess, in terms of the things that you have felt like maybe I had like a heroic moment, right? Because there's some of that that comes with the job. I would like to hope, because that's what I think some people perceive as like a police experience. And then what are some of the lows or maybe some, I guess, unfortunate things that you've experienced that folks might not realize, or things that you encounter like in your day to day?
Ooh. Again, that also comes into what it is you're doing. So if you work for like a special victims unit, you are probably seeing the worst of the worst when it comes to children being victimized.
Mm,
So that experience is completely different. That's a very sensitive one. Most people don't want to do it because you can only see certain things like that for so long.
sure.
Um, as opposed to when you work maybe just in a patrol car and you kind of see that fewer in between. You know, as far as my experience, it's crazy. People ask me that all the time. And I think in the beginning of my career, I had stories. And with time, everything just gets so blended and it becomes so much that I forget.
Hmm.
I don't know if that's like a good thing or a bad thing. I don't know. Maybe a
Sure.
therapist will call that
Yeah.
something else. But unless someone tells me like, oh my God, remember this day? And I'm like, oh my goodness, I cannot believe that I forgot about that, because at the moment it was such a big deal. But I think the worst thing, honestly, is seeing the victims. Like I have a thing where like I hate malice, like
Mm,
just malicious, like like it when you watch these videos or you watch the cameras or you watch the actual crime occur, it's almost like, damn, how can someone do this to somebody else? Like that could be your
hmm.
grandmother, your sister, your mother, or that could be somebody else's uncle. Like what would possess someone to do something so heinous, to another human being?
Hmm.
So when you see things like that, it kind of like waters you down a little bit where you're just like, damn, like it's a cruel world. And I guess you just start to accept it that way. But as far as asking your question about like what I've seen, I mean, I think the worst is honestly maybe, and again, this is subjective. Like I hate seeing children.
Hmm.
Like I feel like sometimes adults get into things, and a man does what man does. But when it comes to children, I feel like they just didn't deserve certain things.
Sure.
And so when you hear a call about a shots fired, and you roll up and it's like you see, a child shot, or you see a pregnant mother shot, or an older lady, or just people that like shouldn't be victims. Like they should. I mean, no one should be a victim, but like
Sure.
it's almost like it hurts more when you see like this innocence.
Yeah.
Where you're like, God, man, what did this person do to deserve something so terrible?
Sure.
Um, Sometimes I think the worst thing is when you go into someone's home and you kind of just see the condition that they're living in, and the condition that the children are living in. Um, you almost feel bad because it's like, how do you break away from this? How do you take this kid out of this situation,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
make it better for them? But because it's so many, it's not just one specific case. This is like it's an ongoing thing. It's a lot of people going through the same challenges.
Hmm.
So you kind of just deal with it, I guess, on a one by one, but that's probably the hardest thing to see.
Sure.
The hardest thing to see. Um, and as far as the highs, I think just well, that's probably a harder question to answer. Um, so let me say this. Like, I think one of the tough things about being in law enforcement or being a police officer is like there's no end result for us, so it's not very satisfying.
Mm,
Like if me and you set out to bake, like we know what we need to do. we look at the ingredients, and we'll put it into the oven, and we know what the end result should be, and we'll get the end result, right? If we
Mhm.
messed up somewhere, obviously our cake will not look so good because we may or may not have, put in the right item or put in the right ingredient, but the end result is the cake. If we're trying to build a house, like it might be a lot of work, but in the end, the house will stand still, right? Like
Mhm.
we built a house. For us, it's like no matter what you do,
Mm.
there's no end result.
Yeah.
There's nothing you can go back to and say like, oh, all my hard work, we were able to do that. We
Yeah.
accomplished that,
Yeah. Like this
you know?
community's been like has been transformed, and we could say like we've cleaned up the streets, and
Yeah,
this
we've
is like
helped this,
a
if
yeah.
you, so when you go through that for years and years and years, it's almost you become, I hate to say, but you become kind of cynical, and it's almost like it becomes kind of routine where you're just like, all right, I'm gonna do what I have to do, but I know that there's no end result.
Mhm.
Like, so no matter how hard I work on this, I'll have nothing to show for it, you know? So when
Deep.
that's, huh?
That's deep.
No, I mean,
And it
I'm
makes me
just,
sad. No, no, no. And it's not a knock at
yeah,
what you're saying. I'm just
yeah,
saying that as a very real experience and feedback, like if I work on something and I'm like, wow, I did that project, and I can get kudos because I completed that project, and the people around me are happy with the work that I did, to feel like I have something tangible to point to. And it's a legitimate point. And I could see where you're coming from of like, what is there the feedback, that feedback and that gratification, and then also what is the outcome? Is there a visible outcome to the work that you're doing? And I could totally see where that might not happen. And it is, to be fair, so complex. It's multifactorial. It's lots of people's energy that we need to make such a transformation happen. And it's like, how do you keep pushing forward when you're, I guess, in a way, held responsible by some people for something that is not wholly in your hands? Um, and it is super personal and complex. Like it's someone's living conditions, it's their economic opportunities, it's their upbringing, it's their
yeah,
belief systems, it's their social circle, it's their jobs, it's so many things. Their kids' schooling, it's their kids, community engagement, and it's a lot of things. But
yeah.
I don't know if people
And you, yeah,
necessarily understand that. But it does suck that it would be great if we could say this area, wow, we transformed this. And I could see how after a while, at least for me, that would be very difficult to deal with, because I'm a person who likes to see the fruits of my labor,
yeah,
and that must be very difficult.
yeah. I think every police officer starts out with the idea that like, I'm gonna change something.
Mm-hmm.
And then after a few years, you realize like there's nothing I can change. Like this is just the way of life, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like we're literally held responsible for other people's behaviors.
Yeah.
Like I can't, I can put a police officer in front of someone's door. I can't control what happens inside that home,
Yeah.
you know? But I'm still held accountable for what does happen inside the home,
Yeah.
you know? And
Yeah.
the follow-up of what happens in there. And,
Yeah.
so I think that's one of the things. And I told, I have friends obviously in the education system, and like when we do speak about this, they tell me, well, I asked them the same question. They say nothing brings me more joy than seeing one of my kids that struggle through something, and I've been able to teach them that, and then they come out and they pass the test, or they get the formula right, or they're able to, add on to their vocabulary. So it's almost like what your work that you put in helps someone else.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't feel like that when you're a cop. And as the years go by, you do your best, but there's nothing tangible. There's nothing you can say like, oh, this worked out, or this I,
Mm-hmm.
I was able to build this.
So one thing I sort of wanted to talk about, and I guess it's like a perfect transition for this, is that I guess I'm curious, like, what are the things that you think people who you either interact with, people that you're serving, right? Like working in the police department, folks who are looking in at the police department, what are some things that you think they don't really realize? Sort of like when looking in from the outside and critiquing, like being a police officer, or like how policing happens. And you sort of started speaking to this already about like how it's unique to other professions, but I'm curious if there's any other thoughts that you have about like I guess an external view. Sometimes it's good, could see your point. It's like you become desensitized. So sometimes feedback from persons or people who are not as immersed in it can be helpful because, you know, I think with any job, and I think particularly working for the city, you just keep going, right? Because you're like, hey, there's people looking at us and we
Yeah.
need to like just keep going. And we're like short staffed and we have mandates and the mayor said
Yeah.
this and we got to perform that. And so you kind of just keep trekking along. So sometimes an outside view is helpful because sometimes, hey, you need someone to snap you back in and be like, oh shit, we didn't realize this is happening in this community. It could be like a news coverage or, you know, an elected official that says something's happening in the community. It can help bring you back. But what are some things you encounter? Just like, hey, you know, I think it's one thing to like give feedback and there's another to critique perhaps. And if you had to tell someone who's like critiquing the profession overall and I guess questioning the value of it, would you have any feedback there? I guess like the relationship with police over years definitely has changed. And I do think some people might have beliefs and again, some are legitimate just based on experiences and things that we've seen, but there is value in some reason because right there's a flip side of like trying to keep communities safe. So it's like there's policing and then there's also the intended outcome, right, of keeping our communities safe for those that reside in them and are trying to do their thing and make good choices and live like honest lives. And so if you had people who are like critiquing the profession, what is unique about this profession that people might not realize? And do you have anything for people to like maybe see it a little bit differently?
It's a very good question. What is it unique to?
So I think like one thing you mentioned for sure is like you don't have perhaps like a finished project. If you're a baker and someone wants you to make a baby shower cake, it's like, yeah, I had this vision and I have a blue baby shower cake with like a brown teddy bear on it. You met sort of
Yeah.
like the ask and the need. You know, teachers have their mandates and we'll be having conversations about that because it does come with its like slew of challenges also. But I
Yeah.
guess, and I guess we could have spoke about this too, but it's like, okay, if you're responsible for people's behavior, that's very unique. Like I can go to my boss and say, hey, this person is not meeting that mandate. We got to move this forward. It's different than, you know, and certain things that have come up too. It's an excellent point. I've thought about that also. Like we had those kids that were shot in the Bronx, you know, it was a mom out with her two kids. How do you you know, are you responsible for that behavior, responsible for that community? Or you had, you know, a guy who was like holding his like these foster children sort of like hostage and abusing them in his home. And you have, you know, yesterday's like in our neighborhood, these guys who stabbed and killed someone just for like dancing and you know, just I guess exhibiting joy in their moment. They were just living this moment and they got stabbed and like didn't see another day. And it's so true. Like that's one, an encounter that you have to see that probably many people don't have to be part of. But then it's also trying to manage different behaviors, human behavior, human life, that you have to think about all the things that go into making someone commit such crimes, like you said. I think that's very unique to other professions. And I'm just curious if there's anything else that you feel sort of is part of the profession that people might not realize that makes it unique. So you could say like, hey, like, I don't know, we should defund the police. Police are awful. We should be investing in other things. And I think that there's some legitimacy to that. And there's also the flip side again of like maintaining communities and people who need to manage behavior because at the end of the day, as sad as it is, fucked up as it is, you have people who are trying to wait on a train station on a platform, see if it's crowded to like fill up on someone. And that's horrible, but it exists, you know, like I watch a lot of crime shows. There's lots of awful people out there. Gilgo Beach killer. I'm like, you know, there's people who walk among us that are really just like, you know, whether they intend to
Right.
be or not, they're just like inherently,
Predators. Yeah.
yeah, and evil. And so,
So
um,
go. I think I'm ready to answer that question now. So
yeah.
what's unique about policing is that it's 1/3 of the law. It's 1/3 of justice, right?
Mm.
So even if I do arrest someone who committed a crime, that person now needs to go to court, right? And the court is now responsible for the outcome of this person's actions, right? So we have the law, which is written obviously by legislature. So what's right, what's wrong? Um, what can you do in this area that you can't do in that area, right? On this street, you have to stop, at the stop sign. Another street, you may not have to stop at the stop sign. So every neighborhood is unique into what laws should be, you know, what laws should be, what's the word I'm looking for, enforced there,
Sure.
right? But the law is the law across the board. So if you hit someone, obviously that's against the law. If you steal something, that's against the law. Now, as a police officer, you know that this person can or cannot do that. So you go about your job, and whether it's giving a person a ticket for violating that law, or whether it's arresting that person for violating that law, then that person is going to basically go over to the courts. And now that's a completely different jurisdiction that I have no say of how it's handled,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So that's very unique in the sense. Another thing is I feel that people, it's very easy to put up an opinion on something. Like, and I always tell my friends, like, I don't know anything about education. I have no idea what it's like to be a teacher. I don't know what it's like to run a school. I don't know anything about budgeting and programs. I don't know anything about that. But
Mm-hmm.
it's so easy for me to give my opinion on, oh, they should have done this and they should have done that. When it comes down to, well, what do you know about this?
Mm-hmm.
And I think with policing is one of those professions where everyone has an opinion about the ways things should have been done, but no one's done it.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone's right. And and you have to remember that it is so unique because it's almost an individual's like opinion of how to handle something, right? So what may scare me or what I think is an uncomfortable situation might not necessarily be uncomfortable to you. We
Mm-hmm.
all have different walks of paths, like you mentioned earlier. We all come from different neighborhoods. We all have different, experiences. How you interact with things, how you deal with people, how you deal with scenarios are all going to be, even with all the training you get, you never know how you're going to react. You
Mm-hmm.
never know how you're going to handle it. And even with all the training, you never know what kind of day you had. You might have been working on a parade on a Sunday for 17 hours. And guess what? You go home now, Monday morning, 7 a.m., you start up again, and you're immediately faced with this obstacle, with this challenge, and I probably would have handled it different had I gotten more than 4 hours of sleep, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
every situation is so different. It's different in the sense where, like, and going kind of piggybacking to what I was saying, uh, you can go to, there might be 4 or 5 robberies, right, that have occurred. I'm going up to to the victim and to the complainant, and it's almost like it's just what information. I just need the information. Give me this, give me that. And you almost have to remind yourself that this person is going through a very traumatic moment in their lives right now.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe not for me, because this is my fourth one today, and I still have 3 more reports I have to take. But for this person, this victim, they're never gonna forget this moment in their
Mm-hmm.
lives for as long as they live. Depending on how tragic it was, obviously. Um, but for me, it's just a routine. So you constantly have to remind yourself because it's easy to fall into like that abyss where you're just like everybody's just, everything is just like data, if like
Yeah.
getting information and just retrieving information, and you almost forget about the person. You almost forget about the victim.
Sure.
So that's something I definitely tell my young officers to always keep that in mind. Um, but it can be very unique in that sense where because you do it so often, and this is sometimes a part of a person's life that they will never forget that moment, you almost have to remind yourself that to be personable, to
Yeah.
be, be real.
Yeah.
But obviously every officer is different. Every officer's patient is different. uh I have a story. I remember, um I was out in the field, and we had one person, we're trying to get him to comply with us. And if I'm not mistaken, it was something domestic. And I have one of my best officers with me. He's a very good talker. He's we call him like the whisperer, like he's able to calm people down. And like so on this particular day, we're in this situation, and he's like snaps and he starts yelling, like he just loses his patience, like enough is enough. And the guy's like complying, he's like dragging himself to do what we need him to do. And he's just tagging us along, he's yelling at us, he's cursing at us. which at this point we kind of know, like, don't get hooked, don't get fished. Like, people are gonna say whatever they want to say, and you kind of just got to take it, like,
Mhm.
that's just how it is, there's no
Yeah.
you kind of know that that's people can say whatever they want about you. So at this particular moment, he snapped, and I'm like, what is going on? Like, this is not like him, you know? Anybody that would see that one particular moment will say, oh my God, look how this officer handled the situation. He snapped, he overreacted. That is so wrong. He shouldn't have done that. If I was a cop, I wouldn't have done that. And I'm like, it's so crazy because you just look at that one particular moment, and it's like, before that, I know who he was. All his colleagues know who he is. So even for us, it was like, oh man, that's so weird. Like, why did he react like that?
Mhm.
I also know that he just had twins 2 months ago. So he's working doubles, he's going to parades, he's going to grand jury, he's working the night shift, he's working the morning shift, and he's coming home to try to help with twins. He's probably sleeping only a couple of hours a night. His patience as a human, interacting with another human, is so in this particular, and it sucks to be constantly kind of like on that radar where it's almost like you could be caught at your worst moment, and
Yeah.
everyone has an opinion about that situation, how you handle it, without even really knowing why,
True.
he's so impatient, not knowing that this guy's one of the best people you can ever speak to, but that's it. That's all he's ever going to be known for is that one particular moment where he snapped at some guy who was just being non-compliant with us.
Yeah.
So all these little things make it very unique.
Yeah. And yeah, I feel it. I guess it's in a way we forget that there are people behind the uniform and people behind the role in a myriad of ways, right? And it is unfortunate because I feel like it's like that in life. You might have one negative experience, and maybe you have a negative experience and that's what sticks with you. And there's sometimes like the positive experiences, like, oh, I went to a restaurant 3 times and I love the meal, but the one time the waitress was being like a total biatch and my food was cold, it's like that's the experience that
Yeah,
sticks out to me. I'm like, I'm never gonna go back. And that's hard, right? Because that's also just like
yeah, and
human
I can
condition,
imagine.
human behavior. And to
Yes,
be
yeah,
fair, yeah, and I'd be curious. I mean, there definitely are things where, people have had negative experiences. And to your point, it's like also like the culture. Sometimes you've had friends who've had experiences, family who've had experiences. So you come into that moment maybe with like guarded. And you also have some people, I guess, who are soured by something because maybe you did believe that you'd have a positive interaction and something bad happens and that sort of sours you, right? And so, I do want to honor like myself over the years. And I don't know if you ever went through this growing up because, it's
you hear
like
me?
life in New York City.
Sorry, let me
Yeah.
go back. Okay,
Can you hear me?
can you go back? Can you go back 1 minute? You at the last
Sure.
statement you made.
Sure, sure, sure. So I was just saying that there are certain moments, right, where you do have certain people where they had experiences that maybe soured them. They were legitimate experiences. And I don't know if you've ever experienced this like as a teenager growing up in the Bronx, because I know for sure like my husband has had experiences, right? Are like I had them myself where I was on the playground and we happened to be the people who got caught. All the kids who were causing the trouble were the ones who like ran away. They got hip to it. And we're naive, like, oh yeah, we're just gonna keep going, whatever. But some moms had called the police and we were the ones that got sort of stuck behind and we dealt with the wrath. And it was not a great experience. It scared the shit out of me being like, I don't know, 12, 13, being pinned up against a fence by police officers, one calling my friend a faggot. Like it was horrible. And that scared me. But it also, I will say, scared me, right? Where some kids, to your point of like some people deal with things in different ways. It's like in terms of consequences, like, do you also feel like some people react to authority in a different way? Like, do you find that some people like do honor? And it's like you said, if you're out on foot and you're like, hey, don't do that. Do some people respect it? Do some people challenge it? That just seems like such a complicated dynamic of also not knowing like how things are going to be received. So that's like multi-layered, but I just wanted to honor, that there maybe are people who have had negative experiences and maybe there are people, and we've had this conversation, like not in every profession, you have some people who are good at their jobs and care about their jobs and care to do a good job. And then you also have some people who might ruin it for others and legitimately maybe shouldn't be doing that anymore. And so I'm just curious of like any feedback you have about that, in case people are like, oh, we're only talking about the good things and how we need to be patient with police officers because they're human, and they are. I'm not taking that away. But then you might have some people who might think, well, I dealt with a police officer, pull me over, he was being like a total asshole. Like, what do you say to those things? It's not illegitimate, but it's also like police are humans, and there's probably a lot behind them and their experiences, things you've seen. This is the 10th call I'm responding to. I got 5 more in my queue. People don't know that. And so is there a way to maybe like make that better? How do we make that better? Could we make it better? I don't know.
Uh, that's tough. I think our police department has done a really good job lately of trying to bring the community, like it's kind of like more community-based policing,
Hmm.
Um, but I kind of stand behind the fact that like the laws are the laws, right? So like there are just certain things you can't do no matter who you are. And I really do stand by that. I also know like policing has a very ugly history and we can't change that, you
Hmm.
know? Not everybody there's a cop should maybe be a cop, Not everybody there's a teacher maybe should be a teacher, you know? Um, I mean, have you got, not everybody that works in TSA should be in TSA,
Yeah, sure.
you know? But unfortunately, with policing, it's one of the only professions where you have the power to take someone else's freedom,
Mm.
and no other profession allows you to do that. So how do you navigate through that? You know? Um, I do think that it has become much, much more difficult to get people to comply when you speak to them, when you ask of them, when you tell them to do something. Um, it certainly has become more difficult to kind of get that respect out of people. But at the same time, the whole respect gives respect. I feel that for a long time you were able to speak to someone and say, listen, I'm doing this because of that, or we need you to do this because of that. And now it's like, well, you can go F yourself. Like I'm not doing that. So
Hmm.
then how now in an authority figure, how do you handle that? Like
Yeah.
society needs rules. Like if if you have a child, and you say, listen, you got to pick up after yourself. Well, I'm not doing that anymore. What do you
Mm.
mean not doing it anymore? I'm your parent. I'm telling you that you have to do that. How does a parent now navigate through that situation with their child? So how does a police officer navigate through when I tell someone, listen, you got to stop doing this, or you can't do that, and they tell me, no, I'm not complying with your orders. Like how do you now navigate through that situation? Um,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, can you almost repeat the second?
Yeah, no, I'm honestly, my question and my feedback was like totally mishmash. It was just a reaction, but it's just the reality is that some people have had negative experiences, right? And so we sort of spoke about that. And you mentioned that you do have some people who
Yeah,
shouldn't be in certain professions, and that's
yeah.
legitimate. And I also, I just it's calling out, like, part of our conversation so far has been a very helpful one. And I thank you for your experience and such. Is like at the end of the day, you're dealing with humans, and you're also dealing with folks who are just like us, but dealing with very unique circumstances. So I think it's just trying to like honor and just tip out the scale, right? Because I think that's some of the
Yeah.
feedback that people will have. It's
Um,
just
Yeah, I don't know how to fix. I'm sorry, and thank you for reminding me again. Again, going back to the NYPD has done a really good job with like getting the community involved and better community policing. But I think because it's so individual and it's such case by case, even a person who's very supportive of the police department, if you're getting pulled over one day and you're already having a bad day, that's going to be a bad experience, no matter
Mhm,
who the officer is, you
mhm,
know? So like so many things have to go right for a person to feel that, oh, all right, that was a good interaction. Like as adults, as humans, like no one really wants to be told what to do, right?
sure.
Uh, Especially if it's something where they think it's minor or like, oh, I was on my cell phone. Like, well, everybody's on their cell phone. It's like, yeah, but I caught
Mhm.
you on your cell phone. You shouldn't have been on your cell phone. Why do we pull over people for being on their cell phones? Because people get into car accidents all the time and it causes injuries to people. And so all these there's always like this ripple effect of why we do things,
Sure, sure.
Why are we always messing around with this, always pulling people off at the stop sign? Because people blow the stop sign all the time and then people get hit or, bikers get hit, So there's always a reasoning behind it.
Sure.
Um, but as far as like how do I minimize like negative interactions, I don't really think you do. I think it's reminding our officers that you can do the job without demeaning people.
Mhm.
I think it's reminding our officers that you can you can go out there and make a difference. Like you don't have to yell at everybody or that but in reverse, it's a bigger pattern of people being more aggressive to us.
Mm.
So, whether it's through verbal, whether it's through physical, I mean, I know now there's a thing we call it TRI, and I'm trying to think. I think it's called like threat resistance incident report. Don't quote me on that,
Yeah.
but it's basically every time we are physical with someone, we have to take a report for that. So if we respond to someone who's having an emotionally disturbed episode, which by the way is an astronomical amount that occurs in New York City, like I almost wish I had the data in front of me. But when now the minute we have to be physical with that person, because a person who's going through an emotional episode is not going to respond the same way for a person who's not, So you can't give this person commands and hope that they listen. They're not in the right mind.
Hmm.
So at that point, you can talk to them all you want, but the likelihood of that person responding to you the way you want them to respond is very unlikely. So now you do have to get physical. And every time we get physical, you have to take one of those incident reports.
Hmm.
Um, so it's just a constant balance of like how to handle every situation. Um, so yeah, our cops could definitely be a little more maybe, I don't know, maybe more understanding from the very beginning. I don't even know how to word it in the sense where like every interaction doesn't have to be so rough. But I think it's because of how we're constantly treated that you
Hmm.
almost come off that way.
Hmm. No, I understand. Well, the same way someone might come into an interaction with a police officer in a guarded way, an officer might come back guarded also, just because
Yeah.
it's like the
And
fifth time you've been going through something. You're
yes,
just like, I'm going to protect myself from the onset. I'm going to establish my authority from the get-go because I tried this already, it didn't work, or, whatever,
yes,
fill in
yes.
the
And I
blank.
think when
Yeah,
you gotta remember when you're doing that 10, 100,000 times, it's tough to kind of break the pattern of when
sure.
things work,
Sure.
you know?
Yeah.
But to answer your question, how do we minimize that? I
Yeah.
don't know. I
No,
don't
it's
know. I
fair.
think it takes constant reminder from supervisors to officers. But I also think it starts at home,
Hmm.
you know. It starts with what's taught to us. Something that I always find interesting, and whenever there's a very tragic thing that occurs with police, um, I always look at it and I said, well, was this person complying with the police when this tragic incident occurred? Like whenever you hear someone got shot by the police or someone, ran off and then got hit by a car. And I was like, well, what happened before that occurred?
Hmm.
Did the person pull over? Did the person come out and show their hands? Did the person turn around when asked to place handcuffs on? And I mean, again, 9 out of 10 times, and this is again just my opinion. I don't have data, but whenever you do see those videos and you see those raw videos, and you're like, "Oh my God, I cannot believe that happened." Like, pay attention and ask yourself, was this person being compliant when it happened, or was this person resisting arrest and then shit went really bad?
Hmm.
You know? And I'm telling you right now, if you pay attention to it, it's always the same thing. It's just someone not complying with the police. And I tell my own son, I said, listen, if you get stopped or if you get pulled over, like, I don't care if the cop tells you that you were juggling, pineapples and playing with a monkey in your car. Like, I don't care what they make up, whether you were doing it or not. Like, that is not the time to start arguing back and forth with the police officer, right? Like we live in the greatest country in the world. Like you're gonna have due process. Like you're gonna get a ticket or whether you get arrested, like you're gonna have a moment in court. Like you can go fight this. Like this, that's when you do your talking, but not during a car stop, not during like when they stop you for something, and so in a lot of times these people that do they might be wanted for something or they might have committed a crime and they resist arrest and something goes bad and it's like, well, the police did this, the police did that, and never any accountability on the other person's actions. So
Yeah.
it's a tough balance.
Yeah.
It's so sensitive. It's so easy to cross over and make a mistake. Um, so I think it's just a constant reminding our guys to just be humans. Remember, we're dealing with people at their worst moments. Um, and just trying to be the best person, the best version of you that you can be to help people in the community.
Hmm. And that's like a perfect segue, I guess, to one of my last questions and talking about like your experience and understanding the work that police do and the experiences they've had and just understanding like the human experience on both sides, right? And a lot of the things that you've encountered. And I think part of it is, we have differences between a concept of what it is to police. We have a difference in policy, in practice, and just like what happens, right, in real life. To your point, you can get training a million times over, but until you're in that circumstance, the training might have been there were 3 individuals and then you wind up in there's 7. That changes the dynamic, and whatever you were trained or thought you were prepared to do could, put you out of your element. So there's concept, there's policy of what we intend to happen, what we hope would happen, there's practice, and then there's real life. If you could change anything, I'm curious, like what would good policing look like to you? And what do you think could be done differently that would really make a difference? So, you spoke to the fact that like sometimes you a lot of times you feel like the role does not lend to feeling that gratification or seeing the outcome or like the fruits of your labor, that you're policing this neighborhood and you're seeing an improvement. And you might see gradual ones, right? I feel like we might have been able to say that over the years in certain communities, but it's not like they're tied up with a bow um, sort of experience with this role. So, it could be resources beyond the police department, right? And things that you think would help with community engagement or how we police or um, how we help curb human behavior. Like, what are some things that you think really could make a difference? Could be within the police department and in that role, or resources and supports that you feel are necessary beyond. Because again, it's not just that moment that you met that person. There's a lot of things that happen before and things that will happen after. So it's not just on like law enforcement. It's other things, and we've spoken about that, right? So just curious, like what thoughts you have about that. And that might be a deep thing. and there'll be
Yeah,
more I think that we
it's
talk about, but I'm curious as to what you think
yeah.
about
I'm gonna try to answer that the best I can. Like policing is complex, like I said before.
that. Hmm.
The laws get enacted. We then enforce the laws, and obviously the courts now, apply the punishment to the laws. Um, I wish that we had more unity within the different aspects of the judicial system.
Hmm.
It seems that we have a mission. So every so often, weeks, months, we go to meetings, precinct commanders, detective squad commanders, different units. We all go to one police plaza and they basically do like an audit. Like they would audit any other job, right? They do an audit on us. They do an audit on our complaint reports. How fast did we go to 911 calls? Did we follow up with complainants? Did we take the proper documentation? You know, how do we interact with these people during body worn cameras? Like then they view that. Um, on the arrest, did we charge the proper penal law code? So was the case handled properly? Were there steps in the case that we missed? Well, so we're constantly being audited and we're constantly being held responsible in order to get better.
Hmm.
So, as frustrating as it could be to go down to these meetings, and they make it in a sense where like it's very nerve-wracking. You're going down there to kind of get put on the spot because when you have so much workload, like you're gonna miss things. When you're responsible for other people and maybe they didn't do the job you wish you would have done, you're going to be held accountable for that. So we kind of understand that within us as far as the police department. Um, so I just wish that when we do work on something, that the other side, I guess you would say, like, that we're all on the same page. And it seems to be like we're kind of not. Like, I feel like we're the only ones kind of held accountable. Whether, and you gotta think about it, if like we're held accountable for homelessness, so like we're held accountable for homelessness. We're held accountable for children. We're held accountable for domestic violence. We're held, like we're held accountable for the roads,
Mhm.
right? The streets. We're like there's so many things that are put on the police to be responsible for, you know?
Yep.
Um, and sometimes it seems like we're the only ones kind of like on the hot seat. We're responsible for emotionally disturbed people, you know. So that's why we wear so many hats. You're a social worker, you're a
Mhm.
counselor, you're the police, it's a lot to carry. But
Yeah.
if perfect policing would be more unity within the other aspects of the judicial system.
Hmm.
If I work hard on a case, and I have all the proof that this person is doing this to this other individual, or that this occurred, um, for at least that other aspect of the courts to be like, well, we have all the proof, this is what we need to do, but in order for this to not happen again, I don't feel like you get that. And I think that's one of the things that if I can change, I would have more unity within the judicial system.
Sure.
But with that being said, I don't know what it's like to be a lawyer in the district attorney's office. All
Sure.
right. I don't know what it's like to be a judge. I have no idea what it's like to be a defense attorney.
Yeah.
So I can only speak on that so lightly.
Sure.
I can only speak on that from my point of view. But it seems like more and more, it's almost like we're on one mission and somebody else is on a different mission. And if I think we all work together, it would be a lot better for the city to kind of go in the right direction.
Sure.
Because at the end of the day, people just want to feel safe. You
Hmm.
know, people, you know, people want to feel safe. If things are safe, then people go out. If people go out, we better our economy, right? And tourism and all these benefits of that. But if people don't feel safe, then what's the point? You
Yep.
know? Um, so it's that constant, almost like tugging back and forth of what we do compared to what gets done from other perspective, other entities, I guess what's the word I'm looking for is like other departments of the justice system.
Sure. Yeah. And it is interconnected. And if you can't control it and you don't know it, I could say I've experienced this in my own time working for the city and just in life too. But some use this as an example. When I did certain work, it's like, okay, I work with a budget team to do this. And if budget doesn't understand my work, then, I also don't understand theirs. And because we're just sort of like, oh, it becomes like finger pointing and it becomes, sort of like you're staking yourself in the ground on like your principle and your part of the work and what you need and what others are holding you accountable for. But if you're not talking, if you're not knowledge sharing, if you're not like sort of being nimble and making things better, you get stuck in your own world and the process doesn't get better. And it's complex. As I'm
Um,
thinking of like as a lawmaker, do you know the nuances of this as you're making the laws? As a police officer, you're being tasked with implementing something, but if it doesn't make sense, that's what you're held accountable to. And if, I don't know, if you're a defense attorney, if you're a prosecutor, you're getting something perhaps there's like political things attached to this now. And I do want to talk about this in upcoming episodes of like Law and Order, but if you're being tasked with new changes or trying to, I don't know how to describe it. You're also trying to deal with people and you're not trying to let systematic things impact them. And that's the only thing I can think of like describing it. But if you're dealing with like with a repeat offender, I have encountered programs and was facilitating a program at one point actually, where like you're trying to get around using the legal system or trying to not let people get caught up in the legal system. But then that can also have ramifications because I don't know, or people thinking like, oh, I got passes, or, it's super complicated. So all that to say, it seems like, and it would be ideal if one, the system works smoother, but also was like more responsive, right, to each other's needs. And if maybe there was more awareness between the different branches of like the reality of what's happening and how you can make things better. And government's super slow. I feel like that's like a consistent theme. You have something that's
Yeah.
not working and it's law. I can't even imagine how long it takes to get something revised. Can you just say, hey, we're doing this differently? I don't know. But my assumption would be that probably more times than not, you can't, because there's like a certain law that people are pointing to, or a policy that you have to change. And how long does that take before you can do something that's responsive and helpful? So,
I guess I just wish everybody was on the same agenda.
yeah,
It seems like
sure.
everybody has their own mission. Um, and I think if we were all on the same agenda, so much more things will be accomplished,
Sure.
you know?
Sure.
Like visible things, like things that you can, you'll notice.
Of
And
course.
something as simple as like, I know a few years back, they changed the policy. It's called raise the age. And because of bad experiences, and again, I like I like from where the idea comes from. As as more the more we learn, the more we grow, right? So what something that might have worked 50 years ago might not necessarily work today, and I understand things need to change. Like we need to grow and we can do better, right? Anyway, anytime we can do better, let's do better,
Yeah.
right? But at some point we need to almost take responsibility and be like, oh, this really isn't working, you know, to accomplish our goals,
Sure.
right? So when they started out again, I'm not trying to get too political about it, but just kind of giving you a little bit of the facts with they did the raise the age, and at a few years back, if you were 16 years old, you were charged as an adult. And they realized that a lot of 16-year-olds were just being 16-year-olds, and then getting introduced to the criminal justice system.
Mm.
And it's almost like, yeah, I don't think that's necessarily good. Like they're just 16 years old. Like we've all done mistakes
Sure.
when we're 16. We all get tied up into something when we're, young age, and we don't know the ramifications of our actions. So to be introduced now into this court, into the legal system, I didn't think it was a good idea. So I totally agree with that. And they raised the age to 19. So anywhere from 17, 18, 19, you'll go to family court if you're ever done found to do something criminal or get caught up into something that might have criminality tied to it, and that's fine, and I'm okay with that. I think the problem is now that it's like it's just a brush across the board. So it's not an individual that got arrested at 17, never been in trouble before. Like he should go to family court, and that's it. Like, parents should take accountability for it. If there's a program we need to help them with, if there's something else we need to help them with, like have those resources available for them, and that's it. But when
Mhm.
you have the same child committing the same crime at 16, 17, 18, now you almost got to say, like, is this working?
Mm.
Like, what are we, who are we helping now?
Mhm.
Because what's going on is that now you're creating an environment again for children, because they're still children. I get that. They're teenagers. Their minds are developing. They still don't know the ramifications of consequences the way you would at 30 years old or 40 years old. Um, but we're allowing them to explore this idea that I can keep doing this and
Mhm.
nothing's gonna happen.
Mhm.
I can keep doing this and my mom is gonna pick me up. I can keep doing this and I'm gonna go to family court. And I just have to do a program after school, no matter what it is that you did. So
Mhm.
we are starting to see the result of that with
Mhm.
the volume of shootings within
Mhm.
young teenagers. And there seems to be no stop to it, because it's almost like a tick for tack,
Mhm.
So if I shot at my friend, when he gets out or when someone else gets out, they're gonna shoot at him and they're gonna be out the next day or the next week, right? And what's gonna happen? Well, I gotta get paid back. And it just continues to be a tick for tack,
Mhm.
and especially for that mind that's undeveloped, that they don't understand what they're doing. At some point we need to intervene and say, well, you can't do this anymore. These are the consequences of this action.
Mhm.
Because now we went from trying to help that individual, that teenager that just maybe committed a crime once or twice, and it's not a bad kid, just made a bad choice. But
Mhm.
now we're almost like allowing another population of kids to think that it's okay to do these things over and over and over because there's no consequences.
Mhm.
Um, so there's a lot of things that I wish could change. Um, but again, I think it comes back to everyone just having the same the same ideas, the same goals. And like you
Yeah.
said, in government, it's very difficult. There's too many layers to it.
Yeah.
So even if you agree with someone else, the minute that third party or that fourth party doesn't agree with the way you want things done, then there's going to be conflict and it's not going to go smooth.
Mhm.
And ultimately, it's the public that has to, you know, feel the brunt of that.
Yeah. That's awesome. So I had so much more on our list of things to talk about, but wow, um this was great. And I would love to know, hopefully you'll be back on again, but I had so much more to talk about. So stuff like, oh my gosh. And a lot came from this too. But I know we've had conversations about and I'd love to have like follow-up conversations about the funding of the police and not necessarily about the concept itself, but like if this were to happen, like how could we re-strategize, re-envision what policing looks like, but also like the resources that would need to go into supporting like safer communities, if that's like the end goal. And to your point, I don't know if that what the end goal is and what the vision is, but I would love to sort of dig into that a little bit more. So that's a topic that I have for us to talk about, but we didn't get to. Law and order for sure, of like, the consequences and seeing how the system plays out. I would love to dig into that a little bit more. And then a bit about politics. Like I previewed this and would love to talk about this, but the change in administrations and I guess like the impact that has on you and your
Tremendous
day-to-day
impact.
work, right? Like, you have a policy approach, you could talk about Bloomberg, the whole stop and frisk was a big thing. And then we stopped that and then we're slowly reintroducing it. And it's not to say the concept, but what does the constant shifting of policy and practice do for people if you've been in the force for a period of time, or if you're constantly getting mixed messaging, or like you said, some external party gets involved, and then all of a sudden you're supposed to the directives that you got or the approach changes. And so I definitely want to eventually dig into that a little bit more. But today I think we did a lot, I made a lot of headway, and I hope it's enlightening. And I appreciate you sharing just your experience and your insight is a lot that I learned because it's just things you don't know. And I ultimately found that quote and I do want to share it because I think for this conversation and for others, I think it's important and for life. But that quote went from Adam Grant, as I mentioned earlier, if knowledge is power, then knowing what we don't know is wisdom. And I think you spoke to this, and I so appreciate you for that and for your honesty and your transparency and for being vulnerable in the sense of like, I'm not just going to stand by this, but I know there's ways we can do things better. And I know that I don't have all the answers and I can't speak to everyone's expertise. Not everyone's like that. So I do want to say that too. But there's always something we can learn and there's always ways that we can do things different. And you just spoke to that. And so, one, I want to thank you for taking a risk as a 22-year-old kid for, taking on this job. It seems like a very difficult job. And I can't even think about so other dynamics to this too, which we could talk about with other people, even with your families. Like you mentioned your wife, your family, the implications that has on your family to take these things home with you. How do people manage that? Like I think of soldiers as being a police officer comparable that like the shit you encounter at work spills off at home. I guess it might depend on your personality, but there's so many other things that we could talk about. And I
Oh
can
yeah.
say like kudos to you, to your family, to those of you that to those that have supported you in this profession and in that line of work and not being
Oh,
home for days at a time.
yeah,
Like I don't know how to manage with all that.
I'm very thankful for them, honestly, because I feel like they keep me humble. Because
Yeah.
there are times that I might go into a little rift, and this and that, and and it's almost like you got to check yourself.
Mhm.
So again, going back to what I mentioned earlier about like just reminding yourself that we're all human, like we're all just people living through this life, just trying to do the best we can, you
Mhm.
know, and to take less things personal, to listen more,
Mhm.
to try to be more understanding. And it's like the older I've gotten, the less judgmental I've become
Mhm.
because I recognize that everyone is going through something, you know? whether you're a civilian or a cop or, or teacher, nurse, whether you're a deli worker, whether, everyone's going through something. And I
Mhm.
think that we just have to be reminded of that all the time. So I appreciate my friends and my family because they always keep me on check and just remind me that, you know,
Yeah.
no one's invisible, you know?
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. So one thing I want to sort of end on just for shits and giggles, because we've spoken a lot about the police experience. So I watched Law and Order a lot growing up. I'd sit, be cleaning. I'm like watching Law and Order, reruns, SVU, the old school one, hours on
Yeah.
end. NCIS was the CSI, all those things.
I
Recently, I
love those
was
shows.
watching. So okay, I'm kind of like, what do you think
No,
of those shows?
they are you kidding me? They're great. They solved the case in an hour.
I know. I was like, wait, this person just went from their precinct and then next door, they just went through
Yeah,
like a swinging door and then there's like bodies. There's a
that's
morgue
it.
right next door.
You know,
I was
they
like,
they
wow. And
they
do you
get
have
subpoenaed.
like,
They get subpoenaed before the commercials.
yeah,
They get the evidence before the.
yeah, yeah. I was
It's
like, wait, she
pretty
woke up this morning. She had time to curl her hair and have on makeup. And then this one's like walking around with music in the
you know,
background. I guess working
they,
in life has made me more cynical to them. But I was like, what's your
it's,
experience and thought on those shows?
I think it's great entertainment. It's
Yeah,
really what it is.
yeah.
But it doesn't take into light that detectives do not have one case they're working on. You
Mm,
know,
yep.
they have 30, 40, 50 cases. You know,
Yikes.
it's an abundance amount of work and responsibility. Um, it's a lot of time away from your family. It's not, people are not always as compliant in the shows. It's not as willing to talk to you about what they saw and what they did. But it makes great entertainment. I mean, I like it. Uh, I always watch those things. I like it because what it is? They solved the case in an hour.
There you go.
It
So
went
that's how
down
you get your
very.
gratification.
That's my gratification. Like, oh my God, that was great work. But for us, there's just so many loopholes. There's so many things that don't apply to television that we have to deal with. You know,
Mhm.
I'll give you a quick one, right? And I know that
Yeah.
something as simple as what we call discovery laws, right? So in those shows, they'll talk to someone and they say like, yeah, I saw the white van. It went down the block. I think it belongs to Jimmy from the bar down the block, right?
Yeah.
If if in real life I got a statement like that from someone, I have to put it in my case. So whenever something does happen and goes to court, that has to be presented. So now that person who got arrested just knows that this is the man who witnessed the van and basically identified him. So once people realize that in real life in the neighborhoods, we're like, oh man, wait a minute, this is going to go to the courts and people are going to know that I was the one who said
Mm,
this. I don't want to be involved
mm,
because at the end of the day, like I don't live in this neighborhood. I'll go somewhere else. But this person does. This person takes their kid to school. This person goes to the local bodega. And it's like if when this person is let out of jail, they're gonna know because the
mm,
defense attorney is gonna tell them, oh, the only reason they were able to identify you is because that tenant in 3B,
mm.
she looked out the window and she saw you. So now
Yeah.
he knows, and that's something that's part of the discovery laws that you have to do. So little things like that, when you see it on the shows, it's almost like, oh man, I wish we could do things like that, or I wish that was more realistic. But it's just entertainment.
Sure.
It's just entertainment.
Yeah. Cool. No, it's interesting, but that's
Yeah.
awesome. Okay.
And listen, I'm looking forward to coming back,
Yeah.
hopefully answering your questions. I know sometimes I get a little bit off topic,
No.
but it's because it is so complex.
Sure.
It's not just one way. There's so many layers to it, and especially New York City, where depending on where you work, your answers might be very different as well.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to kind of be not just give my answer, but kind of give like a more general answer.
Sure.
That what someone else might also agree with that works in a different place and has a different experience of mine.
Sure.
Because it's so different. Everything is different. Even the shift that you might work is different. Someone
Yeah.
who works midnights in Central Park, you know, has a very different experience than someone who works midnights by Yankee Stadium or Times Square,
Mm,
and even that alters the way that officer does his job.
hmm.
So it's a very complex thing. But I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah.
Um, and I just hope that I was able to kind of like help out with some of the questions you have, and I'm looking forward
Yeah.
to the next
Yeah, of course, of course. And I so appreciate it. I think lots of things to talk about. If you have any other colleagues that you think might be willing to come on and like speak their experiences, so certainly happy to cast the net, because the hope is to, try and have it be reflective of a lot of people's experiences, because it does vary so much across even the different types of work that you do working within boroughs, between different agencies and stuff like that. And so the goal is definitely to try and get as many voices as possible. And I really appreciate all that you do and the fact that you came on, and it's a lot more to dig into. So much more to dig
one.
into. So I'm so grateful. And today
Many
we just
layers.
focused on like what it is to be a police officer. And wow, I was like, I didn't think it would take, not that I didn't think it would take that long, but it's such a rich conversation and it is complex. And there's so much more I want to talk about because, again, just to give people, you've spoken a lot of detail about a lot of the work that you do and the consequences and stuff like that. And then there's other aspects of things that we're encountering in the city right now. And I just love to get, your perspective or others' perspectives on what it's like on that side, right? And then trying to bring it all back at some point to things that we can advocate for as citizens, as people who are working in these systems to try and make them better. And so today was just really focusing on understanding what goes into this on a day-to-day, because I know for myself, I've heard about it piecemeal and I've seen what I see on TV and this, things you hear in stories and reading articles and clippings and stuff like that. And it's part of the story, but it's not, it's a vantage point, right? And there's multiple vantage points and perspectives and stuff like that. And so hoping to continue the conversation. And I am very grateful for you coming on and taking the time. And we'll see. It's just so much more that came out of it. I feel like, oh my gosh, there's so much more to get to, but that's okay. Hopefully we can make time work. But we'll see what comes of this. I'm hopeful that, and I'm curious, to see what kind of feedback people have and if this has enlightened them in any way. And if they have more questions, also curious too, like if others have questions, I might open that up at some point of like,
Yeah, sure.
you've encountered this and then what did that mean? Or, if you've experienced this or you would like thoughts on this, just because it is a perspective to have. And I think an aspect of the equation that we have to think about as we're trying to think about how we police people. Something that we've spoken about too offline too is like also victims, like what's that perspective? And I think like the advocacy behind that for not only just like managing the crime and law enforcement, but like managing victims, supporting victims. Customer service came up today, and like what resources do you need to provide a more positive experience to people? So much more that came out of this, but it was a very enriching conversation and I'm super grateful. And so fingers crossed we can get something on the books in the next couple of months to keep this going.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Well,
Thank
thank you
you.
again. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. All right. Hey, everyone. I just wanted to do a quick close for this discussion. Thanks again for my guest, for joining me. I hope that this will be the first of more discussions, as I mentioned numerous times, for what I'm going to say is our Talking the Beat series, to learn more about policing and the policing experience and the policies and practices we can advocate to change, and the myriad of topics as have sort of come up related to public safety here in New York City. The goal of Civil Conversations and why I do this is to give people, the public, and people in sort of like spheres of influence, or those who are more keen about their communities or tapped into their communities, a chance to hear from people who do great and meaningful work behind the scenes. I hope that you took something away from this conversation and are open to exploring these topics a bit more with a newfound sense of curiosity. It was really enlightening for me, and I hope there were some aha or like, wow, I didn't know that moments that support you in like a discovery process, and maybe challenge you or inspire you to challenge our current systems with this new information that you have, this new perspective, this new insight. As always, I'd love to hear from you and your thoughts on the podcast. If you work for the city or have in the past, I'd love to connect to hear about your experience. If you'd ever like to chat or be a guest or have someone that you think would be great for our community to hear from, please let me know. You can reach out to me at Liz@civilconversationsnyc.com. Also, my son started a YouTube channel over the summer, and he asked his mom, as a fellow creator, to give him a little plug for his channel. If you're up for supporting an aspiring 10-year-old with achieving his vision of being a famous YouTuber, please like a couple of his videos and subscribe to his channel. I'll have the link in the show notes, but he is Rookie YouTuber 999, and I'm super proud of him. He has, dozens of subscribers, but has thousands of views. And so he's really putting in effort, and I'm trying to support him. He's doing a great job. Also wanted to give a huge shout out to the Personal Details podcast, former colleague of mine, fellow creator, and my trainer who put me onto Anchor, which is now Spotify for podcasters, as one who works for the city and has her own podcast as a way to sort of flex her creative muscle. She has been amazing in supporting me and not only navigating how to be a podcaster, but has showcased me a couple of times on her podcast. So eventually we'll find a way sometime soon, hopefully, for her to be on my show or for me to be on hers. But I just wanted to give the Personal Details podcast a huge shout out, and I'm linking to her podcast in the show notes as well. I also encountered a really great show called New York City Revealed, NYC Revealed. It's available to YouTube TV subscribers. So if you happen to have some type of streaming service, it seems like it might be available beyond YouTube TV. But it's a really great show. It's something that I came across in trying to find ways to do some research about New York City services and New York City facts and such for past episodes. And so I found it to be really educational. They cover things around topics of operations, things that happen behind the scenes to keep our city running, stuff like water management, sanitation, pest control. They even cover some things, and I learned a lot of facts about, some of our landmarks here in the city that I just didn't know, like the history and how they all sort of came to be. So it's really interesting. So I'll also link to that in the show notes. So do check that out. I'm trying to build an awareness and a knowledge of New York City in a myriad of ways. And so I always appreciate you all for listening. Again, please do keep in touch. And until then, let's keep the conversation going.